Houston Texans have some decisions to make with this wide receiver room. Before we get into that, this is the Texans Better Talk Show. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more daily Texans content. Let's get straight into this. The Houston Texans have two wide receivers set to be free agents, and they are Stephon Diggs and Robert Woods. And let's get talking about both of them. Let's start with Stephon Diggs. And when Stephon Diggs isn't out partying with Cardi B, he's actually a very efficient wide receiver. This season, 47 catches, 496 yards, 3 touchdowns, only 8 games played, and unfortunately 1 torn Achilles. He was on pace to have a 1,000-yard season. Now he's going to have to rehab again. Keep in mind, Stephon Diggs has never had a major injury in his career, and this is a very significant one, being that torn ACL, especially at his age, being 31 years old. Now, one interesting thing to note about Stephon Diggs is if the Texans would have actually signed him February 17th before his contract expired, they would have been able to spread out his cap hit. Unfortunately, they didn't do that, so now there's a $16 million cap hit set for 2025 that we as a team are going to have to work around. I'm not as upset with the decision not to re-sign him. I think it's really early. And I also just genuinely don't know if Nick Caserio is really set on re-signing Stephon Diggs. I also don't know if Stephon Diggs himself was set on coming back to the Houston Texans that early. So overall, on the Stephon Diggs thing, I think it's very unlikely we see him re-sign. He's probably going to garner between $12 to $13 million this next season. And I don't know if the Houston Texans are in a position to make that signing or want to, especially since he's coming off such an injury. And when you take into account the fact that we kind of ripped up those last 3 years of his contract to get out of his deal easier, this just kind of seems like the way it's going to go with Stephon Diggs. Now, the second wide receiver set to be a free agent is Robert Woods. Robert Woods had 20 catches this year, 203 yards, 0 touchdowns. Now, to put that into context, this was somewhat of a down year for Robert Woods. He played 15 games this year. In 2023, Stroud's rookie year, he played 14 games, had 40 catches, and 426 yards with a single touchdown. So he quite literally doubled his production last year in 1 game less that he played. So I don't know about the Robert Woods conversation. An interesting thing to note with Robert Woods is he has no cap hit with the Texans. His deals is completely done. The Texans can choose to completely move on from Robert Woods. I know I've heard that a lot of players speak very highly of Robert Woods in that locker room. They say he's a great leader, really that veteran presence in that wide receiver room. He's not the most productive player. Apparently, he runs block really well, so I wouldn't be extremely surprised if the Texans chose to sign him again. It would have to be maybe like a 1-year deal, maybe in the $8 million range. I think that makes a lot of sense. Not my favorite signing, but as we start looking at these wide receivers, you're going to see that at some point it becomes very necessary to start making some other signings. And with that, let's get straight into this actual core receiving group that we have signed on the Houston Texans. So here's that group, and you can kind of start to see where the Texans wide receiver room is in some trouble. It's worthy to note that Xavier Johnson, Johnny Johnson, and Kearis Jackson were all signed to future and reserve deals. Basically, what that means is they can no longer shop around for teams. The Houston Texans are the only teams that can sign them, and they don't have to sign them. They can choose to cut them once training camp starts up and comes to a close. So these guys never took any significant snaps with the Houston Texans. Basically can't count on them. Now, Johnny Johnson and Xavier Johnson, those are just some bodies to put in the room that they're going to try to compete. They're going to try to knock some people out of their spots, but I would be very surprised if both of them make the team. The reason why I didn't directly put Kearis Jackson into that mix is because Kearis Jackson was actually signed with the Titans last year primarily to be a punt returner, and if you've noticed, the Houston Texans don't really have a punt returner. They tried throwing Tank Dell out there. He's done. They tried throwing Robert Woods out there. Robert Woods actually had some scary fumbles that happened on punt return. He also just wasn't a great punt returner. And Xavier Hutchinson, they've tried to have him return kickoffs. I don't believe they've had him return punts. Those are very different things. And he doesn't look like the best athlete when he's returning kicks either. So that's why there's maybe a star by Kearis Jackson. Maybe he ends up making the roster simply to be a punt returner. But we're talking about true wide receivers. We're not really talking about punt returners right now. So we can cross off Kearis Jackson as well. And I've already kind of touched on this, but Tank Dell is set to miss the entire 2025 season with that scary injury that he sustained. So we can basically cross him off the list as well. If you're wondering about Jared Wayne, the Texans actually waived him. That was the player who unfortunately injured Tank Dell and who had a target, I believe, in the divisional round against the Chiefs. He is no longer on the team. And so who's left in the wide receiver room? Well, we have Nico Collins at the top, John Mechie, and then Xavier Hutchinson. Nico Collins is your wide receiver one. No need to talk about him. He's your wide receiver one. John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson, if they're your wide receiver two, you are in serious trouble. Even if they're your wide receiver three, I don't know how much you can count on them. This just shows how little depth we have at the wide receiver room currently. John Mechie, at this point in his career, is a very disappointing second round pick. I know he's been through a lot, but the production just has never been there. Xavier Hutchinson, I don't feel as bad about. He was a 6th round pick, wasn't really expected to do much, but he's had a couple big plays, but still, when Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs went down, neither of these guys stepped up on a consistent basis, and you really, really need to go look at other wide receivers. So where can the Texans look to try to sign new receivers? Well, the first place is obviously free agency. Here's a list of some relevant free agents. Now, keep in mind, this isn't an exhaustive list. There's a lot of other wide receivers that I left off this. Looking here, there's some pretty big names. T. Higgins, obviously the biggest name, the biggest wide receiver free agent this year. It looks like the Bengals are choosing to franchise tag him, and they are going to try to figure out, move some money around to keep T. Higgins with the Bengals. So he's not really an option. Keenan Allen has been very vocal about wanting to either play in Chicago or LA. His whole family lives in LA. He's made a lot of money already. So I think Keenan Allen stays with the Chargers. And ultimately, look, he's another aging receiver. I don't know if you really necessarily want to sign Keenan Allen. So I've kind of skipped ahead. I've circled some interesting names. Amari Cooper is an interesting name from the Bills. He's getting up there in age, and you might have to sign, a $20 million, $22 million contract with him. Chris Godwin's another interesting name, obviously coming off a really brutal leg injury. If T. Higgins and Keenan Allen ultimately don't hit free agency and they get retained, his value is going to skyrocket just because of his production that he put up this past year. Hollywood Brown, another great signing if you can get him for like $9 million. I feel like the Chiefs are going to try pretty hard to keep him though. Darius Slayton, another name. Mac Hollins from the Bills, a good name, maybe just to have as a wide receiver 3 option, maybe a wide receiver 2B option. And then Nick Westbrook from the Titans. I doubt the Titans let him go, but he's another name that caught my eye. Where else can the Houston Texans get wide receivers? Well, how about trading for a wide receiver? Cooper Kupp will most likely no longer be a Ram. The Rams stated that they want to trade him. Now, again, when you're trading for a receiver, you're going to have to give up assets, most notably draft picks. Here are Cooper Kupp's stats from last year: 67 receptions, 710 yards, 6 touchdowns. Now, as they got into the postseason, the Rams started to utilize Cooper Kupp less and less and less. Cooper Kupp is far from his prime, far from his glory days when he won the Triple Crown and ultimately Super Bowl MVP and a Super Bowl. But he's still a serviceable receiver. He is getting up there in age, set to be 32, has had a history of knee injuries and leg injuries. But look, like I said, you saw our wide receiver room. The Houston Texans need depth. If they want to go ahead and sign Cooper Kupp, hopefully they only have to give up a 4th rounder. I could see a 3rd round pick potentially being up there in the mix. The other thing with Cooper Kupp is, as it stands right now, he's set to have a cap hit of $17.8 million in 2025 and $17.3 million in 2026 with the Rams. So when you trade for him, you're going to have to restructure that contract. It's going to be slightly more expensive for an older, aging receiver. Almost kind of feels like a Stephon Diggs Part 2 type of deal. And of course, the name that gets the most press, Garrett Wilson. Now look, there has been nothing said from the Jets organization about trading Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson himself has voiced a little bit of wanting out. He kind of wants out of the Jets organization. I don't blame him after they tried to make the Jets organization an old Packers retirement home. I really don't blame him, but I just don't see Aaron Glenn giving up Garrett Wilson in his first year of being a head coach. And the big thing with Garrett Wilson is he's going to be very expensive expensive to trade for. You're probably going to have to give up a first round pick, maybe a second as well. Oh, and by the way, his rookie contract ends after this 2025 season. So then you've got to go pay Garrett Wilson a lot of money as well. Around the same time, you're going to be looking to pay Stroud and Will Anderson. So Garrett Wilson, obviously an extremely talented receiver. I don't know if he makes the most sense financially and from just having to give up assets. And I don't even know if it's possible, because if the Jets were to trade him, he would hit the market and you would have to compete with several offers. So that, I think, is where the Garrett Wilson idea ends. But I mean, I would love Garrett Wilson on this team, to be 100% honest with you. Finally, how about the draft? I think the Houston Texans must draft a receiver no later than the third round and probably no later than the second round. I think that first or second selection must be a receiver. So in the second round, who are your options? Well, you have Isaiah Bond from Texas, not as good as Matthew Golden, also from Texas. I don't love him, but he is talented. There's a lot of Isaiah Bond guys. He kind of reminds me of a speedster, like a Tank Dell. So there's probably injury issues that could go along with that. The only thing is his routes aren't as clean as Tank Dell. You have Xavier Restrepo from Miami. He's a dog. I would love him in the second round. Not quite a first rounder, but he's just a slot weapon. Excellent receiver. Jack Besh is my favorite receiver on this list. Jack Besh is someone who played at TCU. Just an all-around great receiver. Really like him. And I really would love him in the second round as well. Savion Williams on the bottom left over here is another receiver from TCU. Now, the thing with Savion is he's a project receiver. Insane athleticism. He benches 350. He does, 350-pound power cleans, 40-inch vertical. He's 6'3", 250 pounds. But he's a project wide receiver. A lot of his fundamentals, his route tree, a lot of those things are not up to par yet. You have Elic Iomenor. I don't think he's a first-round pick. I think he's a very early second-round pick. The Texans not picking super early in the second round. He would be a great addition if he falls. I don't know if you can get your hands on him, though. And finally, Trey Harris from Ole Miss. He, as it stands right now, is kind of just a deep ball guy, not really a slot guy, really just a true X, kind of like a Nico Collins, though maybe not as quick. But there's a lot of guys who love Trey Harris, and there's a lot of guys who think there's a lot more to be desired. So Trey Harris is probably the least person on my list for the second round, but these are some good options. This is not exhaustive. These are just some options that the Texans could possibly draft in the second round. Finally, your first round options. Obviously, Tet McMillan should be on here as well, but there's no way he gets to 25. Luther Burden probably doesn't get to 25 either. I've only seen a couple of mocks here and there where Luther Burden gets that low. Matthew Golden, since declaring, has done nothing but skyrocketed in the rankings. I've seen mocks of Matthew Golden going before Luther Burden. I think if Luther Burden or Matthew Golden are there at 25, it's a must draft. And the person who's most likely to be there at 25 is probably Emeka Ibuka, who played with Stroud in college from The Ohio State University. He kind of rounds off your list for the first round potential options in the draft. And so that's kind of all I've got for this video. Went through some wide receivers, who's a free agent, who do we retain. Also looked at some other free agents as well as the draft and some potential trade options. What do you guys think the Texans should do? Let me know kind of what you would do if you were Nick Caserio. Which receivers do you want to see in the draft? Do you want to see us trade? And yeah, just let me know in the comments, and I will see y'all in the next one. Thank y'all so much for watching. Peace out.